Margaret Holloway's pristine white measuring tape glinted in the morning sunlight like a weapon of suburban destruction. Her sensible beige pantsuit pressed perfectly against her rigid frame as she stepped onto Trevor Williams' lawn, her eyes narrowing with predatory precision. The grass was exactly 3/4 of an inch too long. Trevor, nursing his third cup of coffee and working from home, watched in disbelief through his home office window. This wasn't the first time Margaret had invaded his property, but today felt different. She was muttering to herself, scribbling furiously in a massive leather-bound notebook that looked more like a war journal than a neighborhood compliance log. Unacceptable, Margaret hissed, her voice carrying across the perfectly manicured suburban landscape. Absolute negligence. She pulled out her smartphone, her manicured fingers tapping with a speed that suggested years of passive-aggressive practice. A moment later, Trevor's phone buzzed. Another HOA violation notice was heading his way. What Margaret didn't know was that Trevor had been documenting her daily invasions. Each morning for the past 3 months, she would arrive precisely at 8:37 a.m., measuring, photographing, and nitpicking every square inch of his property. Her obsession had transformed from mere neighborhood supervision to what could only be described as a personal vendetta. Trevor had tried being diplomatic. He'd attempted friendly conversations, brought her homemade cookies, even attended HOA meetings to understand the rules better. But Margaret saw diplomacy as weakness, and weakness was not something she tolerated in her meticulously controlled domain. Today's violation was about lawn height. Last week, it was the placement of his trash bins. The week before, the color of his mailbox had apparently caused her significant emotional distress. As she finished her measurements and documentation, Margaret adjusted her oversized sunglasses and smoothed her perfectly pressed blouse. She looked like a suburban predator who had just tagged her prey, completely unaware that the prey was about to fight back. Trevor took a long sip of his coffee, a small smile forming at the corner of his mouth. Margaret had no idea what was coming. The neighborhood watched, as they always did, a mix of curiosity, fear, and silent admiration for Margaret's relentless pursuit of suburban perfection. Little did they know that this was more than just another HOA dispute. This was the beginning of a battle that would reshape their entire community. And Trevor Williams was done playing defense. Hashtag character notes. Margaret Holloway, 52, retired school administrator, HOA board president. Trevor Williams, 38, freelance graphic designer, recent homeowner. Suburban setting, perfectly manicured, upper-middle-class neighborhood. Initial conflict, lawn maintenance and property invasion. The first move had been made. The suburban war was about to begin. Margaret Holloway believed in rules. Not just any rules, her rules. Rules meticulously crafted over decades of administrative work, refined through countless homeowners association meetings, and enforced with the precision of a military commander. What she didn't anticipate was Trevor Williams' background. Before becoming a graphic designer, Trevor had spent 6 years in military intelligence. Gathering information, identifying patterns, and strategic planning were second nature to him. Margaret's daily invasions weren't just an annoyance. They were a tactical challenge. He began by creating a comprehensive digital file. Each of Margaret's property inspections was documented: time, date, specific measurements, photographic evidence. He color-coded the reports, created spreadsheets, and developed a system that would make any bureaucrat proud. The neighborhood watched in growing fascination. Trevor's house, once considered an outlier, became a subject of intense speculation. Neighbors would slow their morning walks, casting furtive glances at his meticulously maintained documentation board, visible through his home office window. Margaret's next visit came with her usual fanfare. Clipboard in hand, tape measure extended, she marched across Trevor's lawn. But this time, something was different. As she bent to measure a supposedly errant blade of grass, Trevor stepped out onto his front porch. "Good morning, Margaret," he called, his voice unnervingly cheerful. She startled, nearly dropping her clipboard. "Mr. Williams, another violation, I'm afraid." Trevor smiled. "Actually, I have some documentation for you." He handed her a thick manila envelope. Inside were precisely organized reports detailing her daily property invasions, timestamps of her visits, exact GPS coordinates of her trespassing, photographs documenting her repeated infractions of local privacy laws. Margaret's face transformed. The color drained, then rushed back in a furious crimson. Her hands shook slightly as she leafed through the documents. This is harassment," she sputtered. "Is it?" Trevor's smile never wavered. "I'm simply maintaining accurate records, just like you always recommend at HOA meetings." The neighborhood seemed to collectively hold its breath. This was no longer just a dispute about lawn maintenance. This was psychological warfare, suburban style. Margaret's reputation was built on absolute control. She had systematically managed the neighborhood for years, crushing any resistance with bureaucratic precision. Homeowners whispered about her legendary ability to fine residents for the most microscopic infractions. But Trevor was different. He didn't just resist, he documented, analyzed, and prepared to counterattack. What Margaret didn't know was that Trevor had already spoken with a local attorney specializing in property law. His documentation was more than just a symbolic gesture. It was a carefully constructed legal strategy. The war had officially escalated. As Margaret walked away, clutching the envelope like it might burn her hands, Trevor knew this was just the beginning. Her type never backed down easily. They doubled down, and he was ready. Hashtag character development. Margaret, feeling threatened, her control mechanism challenged for the first time. Trevor, transforming from passive homeowner to strategic opponent. Neighborhood, shifting from passive observers to active participants in the unfolding drama. The suburban battlefield was set. The first shots had been fired. The HOA board meeting transformed from its usual monotonous gathering into something resembling a gladiatorial arena. Margaret Holloway sat at the head of the table, her typical armor of pressed khakis and a crisp white blouse now feeling slightly less impenetrable. Trevor Williams had arrived with precision, three-ring binder in hand, a USB drive tucked into his shirt pocket, and a calm demeanor that radiated quiet confidence. Item 1. Margaret began, her voice sharp. Repeated violations by Mr. Williams regarding property maintenance standards. Trevor cleared his throat. Actually, I'd like to discuss potential violations on the part of the HOA board itself. Silence descended. Board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Margaret's right hand, her perpetual secretary, Linda Thompson, nearly dropped her pen. Trevor methodically presented his evidence. GPS-tagged photographs showing Margaret repeatedly crossing property lines without proper notification. Detailed logs of her daily inspections that exceeded the HOA's own documented protocols. Precise measurements revealing that her own property had several violations she conveniently overlooked. These aren't just minor discrepancies, Trevor explained, his graphic design background evident in the professionally prepared slides. These are systematic breaches of our own established guidelines. Margaret's face cycled through several emotional states: shock, anger, indignation, and finally a cold calculation. This wasn't just about a lawn anymore. This was about power. Mr. Williams, she finally said, her voice unnervingly calm, do you understand the consequences of challenging the established order? Trevor smiled. I'm quite familiar with consequences, Margaret. I spent 6 years in military intelligence. Documenting patterns is something of a specialty. The room felt electric. Longtime board members who had quietly endured Margaret's reign suddenly looked interested. Some even leaned forward, eager to see how this would unfold. What Trevor represented was more than just resistance. He represented accountability. Margaret had built her reputation on fear. Homeowners would quickly comply rather than face her wrath. Fines would be issued, appeals would be denied, and the neighborhood remained under her tight control. But Trevor had discovered something critical. Bureaucracies have vulnerabilities, and he was systematically mapping every single one. The meeting concluded with no clear resolution. Margaret called for a formal investigation into Trevor's claims, likely believing this would bury him in red tape. What she didn't realize was that Trevor had already anticipated this move. As they left the community center, the other board members gave Trevor curious glances. Something had shifted in the neighborhood's delicate power structure. Margaret's car, a meticulously maintained silver Lexus, waited in the parking lot. As she sat inside, hands gripping the steering wheel, she made a decision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Trevor Williams would learn that in her world, she always got the last word. Hashtag character development. Margaret, feeling her control mechanism fundamentally challenged. Trevor, emerging as a strategic opponent who understands bureaucratic warfare. Neighborhood dynamic, shifting from fear to potential rebellion. The suburban Cold War had just become very, very hot. Margaret Holloway didn't sleep that night. Instead, she transformed her home office into a war room. Bulletin boards covered with neighborhood maps, color-coded sticky notes, and meticulously organized files surrounded her. Years of HOA records, personal notes, and strategic plans lay spread across her mahogany desk. Trevor Williams had done more than challenge her authority. He'd exposed a vulnerability she'd never anticipated. Her husband, Robert, a retired insurance adjuster who had long learned to stay silent during her crusades, watched her with a mixture of fascination and concern. Margaret, he ventured carefully, maybe this time. Not now, Robert, she cut him off, her eyes never leaving the documents. Margaret began her counteroffensive at dawn. She would dig into Trevor Williams' past, find every single weakness, every potential violation. Her network of informants, longtime neighborhood residents who feared and respected her, would prove invaluable. First, she contacted her friend Patricia Henderson, who worked at the county records office. "I need a complete background check," Margaret explained, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Every permit, every application, every single document related to Trevor Williams." What Margaret didn't know was that Trevor was several steps ahead. He had anticipated her move. His military intelligence background had taught him one crucial lesson: always be prepared for the counterattack. While Margaret was gathering her resources, Trevor was reinforcing his own defenses. He reached out to his attorney, Sarah Martinez, a former military JAG officer who now specialized in property law. "I want a comprehensive review of every HOA document from the past decade," he instructed. "And I mean comprehensive." The neighborhood watched and whispered. Longtime residents remembered other challenges to Margaret's reign, challenges that had been quickly and decisively crushed. But Trevor was different. He wasn't just fighting back, he was systematically dismantling her method of control. Margaret's investigation revealed something interesting. Trevor had a small home-based business, a graphic design studio. Did his business comply with local zoning regulations? She began to compile a file, her excitement growing with each discovered detail. But Trevor had already vetted his home business. His permits were impeccable, his home office perfectly documented. Each potential vulnerability had been anticipated and addressed. The cat-and-mouse game had begun in earnest. At the local coffee shop, neighbors spoke in hushed tones. Some supported Margaret, believing in her strict interpretation of community standards. Others saw Trevor as a long-overdue challenger to her autocratic rule. "He's the first one who's ever stood up to her," whispered Mark Thompson, whose lawn had been fined 3 times in the past 2 years. Margaret's method had always been simple: identify a violation, issue a fine, crush any resistance. But Trevor had introduced a new variable: strategic resistance. He wasn't just fighting back, he was exposing the systemic issues within the HOA's enforcement mechanisms. As the sun set on another day of suburban warfare, Margaret looked at her growing file on Trevor Williams. She allowed herself a small, dangerous smile. This was far from over. Hashtag character development. Margaret, transitioning from confident enforcer to threatened tactician. Trevor, demonstrating strategic preparation and psychological warfare. Neighborhood dynamics. Shifting allegiances, growing tension. The chess match had only just begun. The summer heat descended on Pinewood Estates like a suffocating blanket, turning the neighborhood's perfectly manicured lawns into a battlefield of unspoken tensions. Margaret Holloway's obsession with Trevor Williams had become more than a professional dispute. It was personal. Her latest strategy involved a microscopic examination of every square inch of Trevor's property. She began arriving earlier, staying longer, her white sedan practically becoming a permanent fixture on the street. Neighbors watched with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination as her methodology became increasingly erratic. Trevor's security cameras captured everything. On a Tuesday morning that would become legendary in neighborhood folklore, Margaret crossed a line. Not metaphorically, literally. She stepped onto Trevor's property, her measuring tape extended, completely oblivious to the no trespassing sign strategically placed near his property line. What she didn't know was that Trevor had installed motion-activated sprinklers. The moment her sensible beige pumps touched his lawn, water erupted from hidden nozzles. Margaret let out a screech that could have shattered glass. Her meticulously pressed outfit, a crisp white blouse and khaki pants, was instantly soaked. Her leather-bound HOA notebook, filled with years of violations and personal notes, turned into a pulpy mess. Neighbors emerged from their homes, phones out, recording every magnificent moment. Property invasion. Trevor called out from his front porch, his voice calm and almost cheerful. "I believe that constitutes trespassing, doesn't it?" Margaret stood there, water dripping, her carefully constructed image of suburban authority literally washing away. Her carefully sprayed helmet of hair collapsed into wet strings, mascara running down her cheeks. For the first time in decades, Margaret Holloway looked vulnerable. But vulnerability quickly transformed into rage. "You'll pay for this," she screamed, her voice rising several octaves. "I'll have you thrown out of this neighborhood." Trevor simply smiled and handed her a towel. "Would you like to discuss this civilly?" The neighborhood held its collective breath. This was more than a dispute now, it was a full-blown suburban insurgency. What Margaret didn't realize was that Trevor had already filed a formal complaint with the local authorities about her repeated trespassing. The sprinkler incident would become Exhibit A in his case. Her husband, Robert, watched from their living room window, a mixture of embarrassment and something else. Was it pride? Crossing his face. Margaret had always been a force of nature, but now that nature was being challenged. The HOA board would be hearing about this. But for the first time, Margaret wasn't sure she would be the one controlling the narrative. As she drove home, soaking wet and humiliated, something inside her began to shift. This wasn't just about lawn maintenance anymore. This was about survival, her version of suburban power versus Trevor's strategic resistance. The war had just entered its most dangerous phase. Hashtag character development. Margaret, experiencing a profound moment of vulnerability, her control mechanism fundamentally challenged. Trevor, demonstrating psychological warfare and strategic thinking. Neighborhood dynamics. Moving from passive observation to active participation, the suburban battlefield would never be the same. The HOA board meeting became a pivotal moment in Pinewood Estate's history. What was once a predictable monthly gathering now felt like a political tribunal, with Margaret Holloway's reputation hanging in the balance. Trevor arrived with a comprehensive dossier, meticulously organized, color-coded, and backed by irrefutable documentation. Each page was a testament to Margaret's systematic overreach, her repeated violations of the very rules she claimed to enforce. "Let me be clear," Trevor began, his voice calm and measured. "This isn't about a single lawn. This is about systematic harassment and abuse of power." He presented evidence of Margaret's repeated trespassing, her inconsistent enforcement of HOA regulations, and most damning of all, violations on her own property that she had conveniently ignored. Property line encroachments, unauthorized structural modifications, landscaping that violated multiple community guidelines. The board members, most of whom had silently endured Margaret's tyranny for years, began to exchange meaningful glances. Linda Thompson, Margaret's longtime secretary, looked particularly uncomfortable. Margaret's defense crumbled. Her typical razor-sharp rhetoric dissolved into sputtering protests. "This is ridiculous. I've maintained this neighborhood's standards for decades." But the tide had turned. Other homeowners, emboldened by Trevor's stand, began sharing their own stories. Years of suppressed frustration poured out: excessive fines, unreasonable inspections, personal vendettas masked as community maintenance. Robert Holloway, Margaret's husband, sat in the back of the room. For the first time in their marriage, he didn't look away. Instead, he watched with a mixture of sadness and something that might have been relief. Margaret had built her identity on control. The HOA wasn't just a neighborhood association to her. It was her kingdom, carefully curated and ruthlessly managed. Now that kingdom was crumbling brick by bureaucratic brick. Trevor wasn't just fighting back. He was dismantling a system of institutional bullying piece by piece. The board called for a formal investigation. Margaret would be temporarily suspended from her position pending a comprehensive review of her conduct. Her decades of unchallenged authority had finally reached its breaking point. As the meeting concluded, the room buzzed with a newfound sense of liberation. Neighbors who had lived in quiet fear now spoke openly, sharing stories of Margaret's previous infractions. What Margaret didn't understand was that her power had always been an illusion, maintained through fear and bureaucratic manipulation. Trevor had exposed the fragility of that system. That night, in the privacy of her home, Margaret faced a truth she had avoided her entire life. Power is not about control, but about genuine community. A suburban landscape would never be the same. Hashtag character development. Margaret, experiencing a complete deconstruction of her identity and power structure. Trevor, emerging as a catalyst for community change. Neighborhood dynamics. Transformation from fear to collective empowerment. The final battles were yet to be fought. The aftermath of the HOA board meeting rippled through Pinewood Estates like a seismic event. Margaret Holloway, once the undisputed queen of suburban bureaucracy, now found herself a pariah in the very community she had controlled for decades. Her daily routine shattered. No more morning property inspections. No more clipboard-wielding crusades. The neighborhood that had trembled at her approach now watched her with a mixture of pity and vindication. Robert suggested they take a vacation. "Maybe Florida," he said gently. "Get away for a while." Margaret stared out the window, her reflection a ghost of her former self. The meticulously pressed pantsuit hung unused in the closet. Her collection of measuring tapes sat in a drawer, silent weapons now stripped of their power. Trevor Williams, meanwhile, had become an unlikely hero. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now waved enthusiastically. Children played on lawns with a newfound freedom, no longer afraid of random inspections and arbitrary fines. But Margaret wasn't finished, not by a long shot. She began compiling a new file, not of violations, but of potential counter-strategies. Years of administrative experience didn't disappear overnight. Her mind, always 3 steps ahead, was already plotting. A formal complaint was filed, not against Trevor, but against the HOA board itself. She challenged their decision, arguing that the investigation was fundamentally flawed. Legal documents were drafted, each page a testament to her refusal to accept defeat. Trevor received the first legal notice on a crisp Wednesday morning. The old Margaret was showing her true colors, wounded, but far from defeated. Their chess match wasn't over. It was merely entering a new phase. The neighborhood watched and waited. Some residents supported Margaret, believing in the importance of community standards. Others saw Trevor as a liberator who had broken years of silent oppression. What no one realized was that this battle was about more than a lawn. It was about power, control, and the very nature of community itself. Robert watched his wife with a complexity of emotions. He had spent decades in her shadow, supporting her crusades, staying silent. Now something had fundamentally changed. Maybe, he ventured one evening, maybe it's time we talked about why you've been this way. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. The suburban war had transformed from a conflict of rules to a deeply personal reckoning. Hashtag character development. Margaret, experiencing a profound personal and professional breakdown. Trevor, becoming a catalyst for community transformation, neighborhood dynamics, shifting from fear to complex understanding. The final battle was approaching.